A bitter winter morning in 1880, at a snow-buried little depot out in Wyoming. The wind came sideways like it carried a grudge. Eli Crow had come for nothing but 3 bales of hay. But when he hauled the freight car door open, a thin, wet cough drifted out. Inside, 2 small girls lay curled on a heap of burlap sacks, the older one wrapped around the little one. Lips gone gray, and pinned to her chest a scrap of paper with 2 words, scrawled in charcoal, "Unwanted." Her pale eyes snapped open. Wild with fear, her arms locking tighter around her sister. Don't take my sister," she whispered, her voice no thicker than a thread. Eli tore off his coat and dropped to his knees in the straw. His jaw went hard. The quiet man the whole town stepped careful around, looked straight into those terrified eyes and said it, steady as a nail driven home. "You're coming home with me. Both of you." It was a promise he hadn't let himself make in 5 long years. But what drove a dangerous cowboy to risk everything for 2 thrown-away children? And who pinned that cruel word to a little girl's chest? "Stay till the end, because the truth will be the last thing you see coming." The snow came sideways that morning, the way it does when the wind has a grudge. Eli Crow heard the train before he saw it. Iron on iron. A long groan, like the whole machine was tired of the cold, stood on the depot planks, with his collar up and his hat low, and he waited. He had come for hay. Nothing more. 3 bales coming up from Rawlins, paid for in advance, and a long ride home before dark. Simple work. The kind he liked now. The kind that asked nothing of him but his back and his time. The train shuddered to a stop. Steam rose off it and vanished into the white. Hank, the depot man, came out stamping his boots. "Cold enough to crack a stone," he said. "It is," Eli said. That was the most either of them said for a while. They were not talkers, the both of them, and the weather did not invite it. Eli moved down the line of freight cars, reading the chalk marks for his name. His boots crunched. His breath hung in front of his face and froze in his beard. He found his bales near the end, stacked tight, dusted with snow that had blown in through the slats. He reached to slide the door wider, and he heard it, a cough, small, wet, easy to miss under the hiss of the engine and the moan of the wind. He stopped with his hand on the cold iron, and he listened, and it came again, weaker the second time. It was not a sound that belonged out here. Not in a freight car, not in this cold. Eli set his shoulder to the door and shoved. Inside, against a heap of burlap sacks, lay 2 small shapes, children, 2 girls. The older one had her arms wrapped around the younger, her whole body curled into a shell around the little one, the way a hand closes over a flame in the wind. Her hair was matted with ice. Her coat was thin as paper. She had given the small one her warmth and kept almost none for herself, and you could see it in her gray lips and her gray skin. Eli did not remember climbing in. One moment he was at the door. The next he was on his knees in the straw, with his gloves already off. He touched the older girl's cheek. Cold. Far too cold. There was a scrap of paper pinned to her chest. He brushed the snow from it with one finger. The wind had blurred the edges. 2 words, scrawled in charcoal, came up slow under his hand. Unwanted. Something turned over in his chest. Something he had kept locked down for a long time, in a dark room he did not open. The older girl's eyes came open, pale eyes like the sky behind the snow. They found his face and went wide, and her arms tightened around her sister. "Don't," she said. Her voice was a thread. "Don't take my sister." Eli was already pulling off his coat. He wrapped it around the both of them, all of it, and tucked it close. "I'm not taking anybody anywhere they don't go together," he said. The little one stirred, brown eyes glassy and scared. She looked at him, and her mouth opened. But no sound came, just a breath, just terror with no voice behind it. "Easy," Eli said, "easy now." The older girl held her sister's head against her shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered to her. "It's all right." Then to Eli, fierce as a cornered thing. "She doesn't talk. Don't make her talk." "I won't," he said. "What's your name?" she asked him. Even now she was studying him. Even now, half frozen, she was deciding whether he was a danger. "Eli," she held on a moment longer. Then, like setting down a weight too heavy to carry one more step, she said at Wren, "This is Junie." She's 5. A pause. Our mama said find somebody decent. She said there was decent men still. There are, Eli said. He surprised himself, saying it. He was not sure he had believed it that morning. He lifted them both, one in each arm. They weighed almost nothing, the two of them together, light as a sack of feed. Wren's frozen fingers found his shirt and locked on and would not let go. Hank, Eli said, not loud. He did not need to be loud. Get the doctor. Hank had come up to the door and stopped dead, his face gone the color of the snow. Lord above, he breathed. Are they? Not yet, Eli said. Move. Hank still stood there. Eli, this ain't your business. There's a way these things get handled. The county. They'll be dead before the county finds its hat. Eli stepped down out of the car with a girl on each arm. Doctor now. He did not wait to see if Hank ran. He just started walking. The town was a smear of brown and white through the falling snow. Lamps in windows. Smokes standing straight up from chimneys where the wind led it. People would talk, the quiet rancher, the one who kept to himself, carrying 2 strange children through the square in the dead of a hard winter. Let them talk. He had carried worse and cared less. Wren had gone slack against him, exhausted, her cheek on his collarbone. But her hand still gripped his shirt, as if she had decided finally to hold on to one thing in a world that had thrown her away. Promise, she murmured, almost asleep. It was a word Eli had not let himself say in 5 years. He looked down at the two of them, at the little face that could not make a sound, at the older one who had kept her sister alive with nothing but her own body and her own will. Somebody had written one word and pinned it to a child and put her on a train to be rid of her. But a word is just a word. It is not the truth of a person. It never was. You're coming home with me, Eli said, both of you. And he walked on into the snow. The doctor's house sat at the end of Main Street, the last lamp before the dark. Eli took the porch steps 2 at a time with a girl on each arm. He kicked the door instead of knocking. There was no time for manners. It opened before his boot came down again. A woman stood there in a rolled-up shirt and an apron gone brown at the front. Her sleeves were pushed past the elbow. There was blood on her hands, fresh and dark, and she did not hide them or wipe them on the apron the way some folks would. She just looked at what he was carrying, and her whole face changed. Kitchen, she said. By the stove now. She did not ask who he was. She did not ask whose children these were. She turned and led, and Eli followed. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and something sharper underneath. She swept an arm across the table, and a stack of clean cloth went one way and a tin basin the other, and she made room. Lay them down, careful. The little one first. Eli set Junie on the table, soft as he could. Her brown eyes were half open and seeing nothing. Wren he laid beside her, and the older girl's fingers had to be peeled, one at a time from his shirt. The woman was already working. She had her hands at Junie's throat, then her chest, her head tipped to listen. She pressed an ear flat to the small ribs and went still. How long were they out there? She asked. Don't know. Found them in a freight car. Train came up from Rawlins. Hours then. She straightened. This one's lungs are filling. Pneumonia or near it. The cold's the smaller problem now. She looked at the older girl. She's stronger. She kept the little one alive with her own body heat, didn't she? It was not a question. Eli answered it anyway. Yes, smart girl. She said it to Wren. Not about her. You did right. Wren watched her with the same hard eyes she had watched Eli with. Measuring. Always measuring. The woman moved fast now and without waste. Warm bricks wrapped in flannel, tucked along the small bodies. A kettle already singing on the stove. She mixed something in a cup, honey and a powder, and worked a spoon of it past Junie's lips with a patience that did not match the speed of her hands. You're the doctor, Eli said. He had not meant it to sound the way it did. She did not look up. Ada Vance. And yes, I'm aware of how that sits with people. You can sit with it later. Right now, hold this child's head while I listen to the other lung. He held the child's head. There was a sound from the front of the house, boots on the porch. The door, which Eli had left swinging, banged in the wind. Voices came in with the cold. Hank's and another man's lower. Dot Crow just carried 2 young ones in here like sacks of meal. Dot to the Vance woman. She ought not be doctoring children. She ought not be doctoring anybody. A woman with a knife. Somebody ought to fetch a reel. Ada Vance did not flinch. Her hands did not pause. But Eli saw something cross her face, fast like a cloud over a field. And then it was gone, and she was only working again. He set the child's head down gentle and stood and went to the kitchen doorway. Two men stood in the front room, dripping snow on the floor. Hank, looking like he wished he were anywhere else, and a heavy-set man in a good coat, the kind of man who is used to his opinion being the last one in the room. "This is a sick room," Eli said, "not a saloon." Out the heavy-set man drew himself up. "Now you listen. These children need proper care, not some woman playing at. That woman," Eli said, quiet, "has had her hands inside a dying child since before you got your boots on. What have your hands done this morning?" The man's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. "Out," Eli said again. They went. The door shut, the room got quiet. Just the kettle and the wind. When Eli came back to the table, Ada Vance was looking at him. Not soft, not grateful, just looking, like she was adding him up too. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "They were in your way. They're always in my way." She turned back to Junie and pressed 2 fingers to the child's wrist and counted under her breath. 6 years I've been in this town. 6 years of learning to keep working while men decide out loud whether I'm allowed to. How do you keep working through it?" She did not answer right off. She finished her count. Then she straightened and pushed a loose strand of hair off her face with the back of her wrist, the one part of her that did not have blood on it. "Because the work is true, whether they believe in it or not," she said. "A person is a person, Mr. Crow. Whether they wear a skirt or a sidearm, I don't ask anybody to like me. I only ask to be judged by what I do. That's all anybody fair ever asks." She looked down at the small girl on her table. "And this child doesn't care one bit whether her doctor's a man or a woman. She just wants to breathe. So I'm going to help her breathe." Eli had no answer to that. He found he did not need one. The night went long. Ada Vance did not sleep and did not let him sleep either. There was always something to fetch. Water to heat, a child to turn. Wren came back first, color creeping into her gray lips. And the moment she could move her arms, she reached for her sister's hand across the table and held it and would not let go, even when she dozed. Junie was the worry. Her breath rattled. It would ease and then catch, ease and catch. And each time it caught, Ada was there with her ear to the child's chest, listening, willing the small lungs to clear. Near dawn, the rattle softened. The catch came less. Ada listened a long time, then sat back on her stool and let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. "She'll keep," she said, "probably. The next day will tell." Eli looked at the little girl. Her brown eyes had opened sometime in the night, and they followed him, now, wherever he moved in the room. But she had not made a sound. Not a cry, not a word, not even when the worst of it had her. "She doesn't talk," he said. "No, Ada watched the child too. She can't. There's nothing wrong with her throat. I checked," she paused. "Children go quiet sometimes. After, when the world's done something to them too big to hold." She said it carefully, like a thing she had seen before and not forgotten. "The body protects what it can't fix. The voice goes somewhere safe and waits. Waits for what? For it to be safe to come back." She looked at him. "You can't pull it out of her. Don't try. You can only make the world around her so safe, so steady, that one day she decides on her own it's all right to speak again. That's not medicine. That's just patience." A small, tired, almost smile, "which I'm told I have very little of. So that part's on you, Mr. Crow." The first gray light came up in the window. Snow still fell, but slower now, the storm spending itself. Eli stood by the table and looked at the two girls, one holding the other's hand even in sleep, both of them breathing. Somebody had pinned a word to one of them and put her on a train, and a stranger with blood on her hands had stayed up all night so the word would not come true. "What do I owe you?" Eli said. Ada Vance laughed, short and rough. The first laugh he'd heard from her. "Nothing you can pay in coin. Just don't let anybody throw them away." Twice. The ranch sat 5 miles out, where the road gave up, and the land took over. It was a small spread, a house, a barn, a corral, a stand of pine against the hills behind. Eli had built the house himself, board by board, a long time ago, when there had been a reason to. Since then, it had gone gray and quiet. The curtains stayed drawn. Dust lay on the sills. On the porch, a rocking chair sat empty. Filling slow with snow, nobody brushed off. He carried the girls in out of the wagon, Junie wrapped in every blanket Ada could spare. Wren walking close at his side with a fist in his coat. Wren stopped in the doorway and looked the place over the way. She looked at everything. Who lives here? I do. Just you. Just me. She took that in. It's cold in here, it is, Eli said. Hasn't had to be warm for anybody in a while. He lit the stove. He aired the spare room and beat the dust from quilts that had not been touched in years. He worked without talking much, and Wren shadowed him through all of it, watching his hands, watching the doors, learning the house the way a cat learns a new barn, marking the exits. In the front room, there was a door frame. Eli had started carving it once, vines and leaves up the side, a wedding gift of a kind, slow work for winter evenings. He had stopped partway. The vine climbed half the frame and then ended in raw, unfinished wood, the chisel marks still sharp after 5 years. Wren stopped in front of it. You quit, she said. I did. Why? Eli looked at the carving a moment. The person I was making it for is gone, he said. Her name was Mary, my wife. He had not said the name out loud in a long while. It came out steadier than he expected. She liked things that grew. Wren ran a finger along the place where the vine stopped. She did not say she was sorry. Children who have been through real things rarely do. They just nod, like they understand that some doors stay half open. That night, the wolves came down off the hills. Eli heard them first, that long sound that goes up the back of your neck. Then the horses in the corral started to move, nervous, bunching. He took down the rifle from over the door, and Wren was up off the floor by the stove in an instant. Eyes wide, stay inside, he said. Mind your sister. He went out into the dark and the cold. The wolves were testing the fence line. Gray shapes in the gray dark. He did not fire into the pack. He put 2 shots into the air, the sound rolling off the hills, and the gray shapes melted back into the trees. He stood out there a long while after, making sure his breath smoking, the rifle warm in his hands. When he came back in, Wren was standing in the middle of the room with the carving knife from the kitchen held low at her side. Eli stopped in the doorway. You can put that down, he said. She did not. You came back fast. I told you I would. Men say a lot of things. Her knuckles were white on the handle. I had to be sure, in case you didn't, in case it came in. He understood then what the knife was for. Not for him, for the wolves, in case the man with a gun did not come back. This 9-year-old had meant to stand between the door and her sleeping sister with a kitchen knife. Something pulled tight in Eli's chest. You won't ever have to do that here, he said. But I'm not going to tell you to stop being ready. Being ready kept you both alive. That was you, Wren. Nobody did that for you. You did that. He set the rifle back over the door, slow, so she could watch him do it. Just know the watch is 2 of us now. You can sleep when I've got it. That's how it works in a house. Folks take turns carrying the heavy thing, so nobody carries it alone. Wren looked at him a long moment. Then she set the knife on the table. Not far, within reach, but down. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the first inch toward it. The days that came after were slow and gray and full of small work. Eli did not push the girls. He had learned, somewhere along the way, that you cannot force a frightened animal to come to your hand. You can only be where it can see you, doing the same calm thing, day after day, until one day it decides you are not the danger. So he mended fence with Wren trailing him, and he handed her the wire to hold, and he thanked her for it like it mattered, because it did. He let her into the barn at feeding time and showed her which horse bit and which one didn't. He cooked plain food and put it in front of them and did not make a thing of it when Junie ate with her hands, fast the way a child eats who has known what it is to not eat. Junie did not speak, but her brown eyes followed him everywhere. And slowly the terror went out of them, and something else came in. Interest, the beginnings of trust. One afternoon she stood at the corral fence for an hour, just watching the horses move. And when Eli came up beside her, she did not flinch away. That gray one's gentle, he told her, not looking at her, looking at the horse. Her name's Biscuit. She wouldn't hurt a fly. Some big things are gentle. You can't always tell from the size of a thing whether it'll hurt you. He let that sit. You have to watch how it acts. Watch long enough, and a thing shows you what it is. Junie watched the gray mare. She did not answer, but she leaned, just slightly into the rail beside him, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his arm. That was a great deal from her. He knew it for what it was. In the evenings, after the girls slept, Eli sat by the window and looked out at the snow and the dark. The rocking chair on the porch was still empty, but the stove was warm now, and there were 2 children breathing in the next room, and the house did not feel like a tomb the way it had a week ago. He thought about the word on the paper, unwanted. He thought about who would write such a thing and pin it to a child. And he thought about what Ada Vance had said, that you cannot pull a voice out of a person, that you can only make the world safe enough that it comes back on its own. He figured the same was likely true of trust, of a heart, of a man even. His own had gone somewhere quiet 5 years ago and had not come back, and no one had been able to drag it out, and he had stopped expecting it to return. But the house was warm tonight, and somebody needed him to keep it that way. It was a start. By the second week, Junie was strong enough to travel, and they were near out of flour. So Eli took the girls into town. He told himself it was for supplies. It was partly for supplies, but it was also because a child who has been thrown away needs to learn, slow and sure, that the world is not only freight cars and cold, that there are warm rooms in it, tables with food on them, people who are glad to see you come in. So he took them to Odessa's. It was a low building near the livery, 1 long room with a counter and a half-dozen tables, and a stove that threw heat clear to the door. It smelled of cornbread and coffee and frying onions, and the smell hit you the second you stepped in out of the cold and made your knees go weak with wanting. Odessa ran it. She was a tall woman, older, with gray coming in at her temples, and a way of moving behind that counter like she had built the room around herself. She took one look at the 2 thin girls coming in behind Eli, and she did not say a word about it. She just pulled 3 plates down from the shelf. "Crow," she said. "Odessa, these the ones." It was not a question. The whole town had heard by now. "These are the ones." She came around the counter and crouched down to Junie's height. Slow, careful the way you'd approach a bird. "Hello, little one," she said. "You hungry?" "Course you are. Sit anywhere you like. The seat by the stove's the warm one. Best seat in the house. And I'm giving it to you. So you must be somebody." Junie did not speak, but she went and sat in the warm seat by the stove, and that was answer enough. They ate. Lord, did they eat. Odessa kept the plates coming. Cornbread and beans and a stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. And she did not say a word about the cost. And Eli did not insult her by offering it twice. It was good. For a while, it was just good. The warmth and the food in Wren's face slowly losing its hard set as her belly filled. Then a man at the counter turned around. He was a teamster, big through the shoulders, with a few drinks already in him, though it was barely past noon. He'd been watching Odessa work, and now he set his cup down hard. "Ain't right," he said. "Loud enough for the room, eating food cooked by her hands. My daddy owned folks like her. Now she's serving me like she's some kind of." The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that has a sound to it. Odessa did not stop working. Her hands kept moving, wiping the counter, slow and even. But Eli saw her shoulders square. He had seen Ada Vance do the same thing. The set of a person who has learned to take a blow standing up because sitting down was never allowed. Eli set down his fork. He did not stand up fast. He did not shout. He had learned long ago that the loudest thing in a room is rarely the strongest. He stood up slow, and he picked up his plate and his cup, and he walked the length of the room, and he set them down at the end of the counter, right in front of Odessa. Then he pulled out the stool and sat. "Coffee's the best in the territory," he said to her. Easy, like the teamster wasn't there at all. Always has been. Odessa looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes. "That it is," she said, and filled his cup. The teamster's face went red. He looked around the room for somebody to back him. But Eli Crow was a known quantity in Coldwater Bend, and the look Eli was giving him over the rim of that cup was a look the man recognized from somewhere deep in his animal brain. The look of a quiet thing that could become a loud thing if it had to. The teamster found his coat and found the door and was gone into the cold, muttering, beaten without a hand laid on him. The room let out its breath. Talk started up again. Wren had watched the whole thing with those measuring eyes. Why'd that man hate her? She asked. Quiet, when Odessa had moved off down the counter. Eli thought about how to say it. But Odessa had heard. She came back and set her rag down and looked at Wren, and she answered it herself. Plain, because once child, folks like him owned folks like me, she said. Bought us and sold us like a man buys a horse. Put a price on us. Said we weren't people, just property. So they wouldn't have to feel bad about it. She said it without heat. The way you'd tell a child where the river starts. That's the oldest trick there is. You want to do a cruel thing to a person. First, you tell yourself they ain't quite a person. Makes the cruelty go down easier. Wren was very still. But you are a person. I surely am. Odessa's eyes were steady. And here's the thing they never could take. Hard as they tried. Nobody gives you your worth, so nobody can take it away. Not a man with a whip, not a man with a paper. Not a man who writes an ugly word and pins it where you can see it. She let that land, and her gaze flicked. Just once. To the place on Junie's chest where the note had been. You hear me? A person's worth isn't a thing the world hands out. You come into this world already carrying it. All the world can do is treat you right or treat you wrong. And which one it does says everything about the world and not one thing about you. Wren did not answer, but Eli watched the words go into her and settle somewhere deep, the way water sinks into dry ground. Junie, by the stove, had stopped eating. She was looking at Odessa with her wide brown eyes, and though she said nothing, her small hand had come up and pressed flat against her own chest, over the place where the word had been pinned, like she was checking to see if it was still there. It wasn't. Eli had torn it off in the freight car and crushed it in his fist, but he understood watching her, that the word came off easier than it came out, that it would take a long time and a great deal of warmth to convince that little girl of what Odessa had just said, that she had been born already worth something, and no scrap of paper had ever had the power to change it. That was all right. He had time. He had a warm house and a gray mare named Biscuit, and a great deal of patience he had not known he still owned. It was while they were finishing, pulling their coats on to go, that the door opened and let in the cold and a man Eli did not much like. He came in shaking snow off a coat that cost more than most men made in a season. Silver hair, soft hands, a smile that arrived a half-second before it meant anything. He nodded around the room like a man counting his own cattle. Crow, he said, and the smile widened. I heard you'd taken in some strays. Renton, Eli said. The man's pale eyes went to the two girls and rested there a beat too long, and something cold moved behind the warmth of his face. 2 more mouths on that little spread of yours, Renton said, pleasant as Sunday, in a hard winter. That's a heavy thing to carry. Friend, I do hope you can manage it. He let the smile sit there. Then he tipped his hat to Odessa, who did not return it, and moved off to a table by the window, leaving the words hanging in the warm air behind him like the first faint smell of smoke. Ada Vance came out to the ranch on a Thursday, and then she kept coming. She told herself it was to check on Junie's lungs. That was true the first time. The child had been near death, and pneumonia leaves a mark, and a careful doctor checks her work. But the first visit she stayed for supper. The second she brought a slate and chalk for Wren. By the third, nobody pretended it was only about the lungs. She drove herself out in a little trap behind an old bay horse, her medical bag on the seat beside her, and she came whether the weather wanted her to or not. The road froze hard, and she came anyway. Eli took to watching for her on Thursday afternoons, without quite admitting to himself that was what he was doing. Wren took to the slate like she'd been starving for it. Nobody taught you letters. Ada asked her that first lesson, the two of them at the kitchen table. Mama started before. Wren did not finish the sentence. Before was a country the girls did not travel to out loud. Then there wasn't time. Well, there's time now. Ada drew an A on the slate, big and plain. We've got all winter, and letters don't go anywhere. Here, your turn. Wren gripped the chalk too hard, and the A came out crooked, and she scowled at it, like it had insulted her. That's a fine A, Ada said. It's crooked. First one usually is. Mine was. Ada took the chalk and made one just as crooked beside it, on purpose, and Wren looked at her sideways, not sure if she was being made fun of. See? We'll be crooked together a while. Then we'll be straight. That's how anything worth doing goes. Crooked first. Don't let anybody tell you. They came out straight the first time. They're lying, or they've forgotten. Something in Wren eased. She bent back over the slate. While they worked, Eli found things to do near the kitchen. He was not a man who hovered, but he mended a bridle at the far end of the table that did not strictly need mending. And he listened to the sound of a woman teaching a child her letters. Patient, unhurried, and it did something to the house. Filled a room that had been empty so long he'd stopped hearing the silence in it. After, when Wren had taken the slate off to practice and Junie had fallen asleep by the stove, Ada and Eli sat with coffee and the quiet. You built this place, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd been looking at the bones of it. I did. For her, Mary, Eli turned his cup. She wanted a real home, something that stayed put. She'd moved her whole life, following her daddy's work. She wanted one place that was hers and didn't go anywhere. He looked at the half-carved doorframe across the room. I was building it for her when she got sick. Finished the roof the week before she passed. She never spent a dry winter under it. Ada didn't rush to fill the quiet with comfort. She just let it be what it was. That was a thing Eli noticed about her. She didn't paper over a hard thing. She sat with it the way she'd sat with a dying child's breath, present and unhurried. And you, he said, because it seemed only fair. How does a woman come to be a doctor? She laughed, that short, rough laugh, stubbornly. There's a college back east that takes women now. Not many. They made us sit apart in the lecture hall, made us walk in a side door. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup. I had a professor tell me, to my face, that I was taking a seat from a man who'd actually use it. As if a sick child cares which door her doctor walked through. What'd you tell him? Nothing. I just kept showing up. Front row, every day, side door or not. She shrugged. That's the only argument that ever wins with that kind of man. You can't talk them out of it. You just outlast them. You do the work so well and so long that one day the work speaks louder than they do. A small smile. Course. Out here the work has to speak pretty loud. Some days I'm hoarse from it. Eli almost smiled. He felt it pull at the corner of his mouth, an old muscle remembering its use. It was Junie who turned the whole day over. They'd gone out to the corral before Ada left. All of them, the light going gold and long the way it does in the late afternoon when the cold eases just a little. Eli was forking hay over the rail to the gray mare. Wren sat on the top board. Ada stood with her arms folded against the chill, and Junie stood pressed to the fence the way she did, silent, watching the horses move. The gray mare came over to the rail. She lowered her big soft head and lipped at the hay near Junie's hands. Gentle as anything, the way Eli had told her the horse would be. And Junie, without looking away from the mare, in a voice rusty and small from so long unused, said one word, biscuit. Nobody moved. Eli's hand stopped on the hay fork. Wren went stiff on the rail. Ada, beside him, drew a breath and held it. Not one of them looked at the child. Eli understood, in the way you sometimes understand a thing without being told, that if they turned and made a fuss, they would scare the voice right back into hiding. So he kept his eyes on the mare. He made his voice as ordinary as he could. That's right, he said, easy. Like a girl talking was the most usual thing in the world. Her name's Biscuit. Good of you to remember. Junie reached through the rail and laid her small, flat hand on the mare's nose. The horse let her, and the little girl, who had not made a sound since a freight car in the snow, stood there with her hand on something gentle and breathing, and said the name again. Quiet, just for herself. Biscuit. Eli had to look away then. He turned to the hay and busied his hands and found his eyes were stinging. And that surprised him, a grown man brought to it by a single rusty word. When he turned back, Ada had turned away too, her face toward the gold light, and she was wiping at her cheek with the heel of her hand quick, like she hoped no one had seen. Their eyes met over the top of Junie's head. Hers were wet, so were his. Neither of them said a thing about it. His hand was on the rail. Hers came to rest beside it as she steadied herself, and for a moment the side of her hand was against the side of his. Just barely. Just warm. Neither of them moved it away. Neither of them looked down at it. They just stood there in the gold light with a child's voice come back from wherever it had gone. Two people not quite touching. And somehow that not quite was the loudest thing either of them had felt in years. It was Ada who finally drew her hand back, careful, and cleared her throat, and said something practical about the road freezing if she didn't start home. But she said it soft, and she did not leave for a good while yet. That night, after she'd gone and the girls were down, Eli sat by the window longer than usual. A voice could come back. He had watched it happen with his own eyes. You could not pull it out of a child. You could only make the world warm and steady and safe, day on day. And wait, and one gold afternoon it returned on its own and named a gray horse. He wondered, sitting there, what else might come back that a man had given up on? He did not let himself finish the thought. But he did not put it away as fast as he once would have, either. The trouble came on paper, the way Renton's trouble always did. It came by a rider one cold morning, a thin clerk from the bank who would not meet Eli's eye. He handed down an envelope and turned his horse and was gone before Eli had the wax broke. Eli read it twice at the kitchen table. Then he set it down very flat and very careful, the way you set down a thing you'd rather throw. What is it? Wren asked. She was getting good at reading his face. Too good for 9. Bank business, he said. Nothing for you to carry. But it sat in his chest all day like a stone. He took it to Marshal Tom Beckett the next morning. Beckett had a small office off the square with a stove and 2 chairs and a way of listening that made a man feel heard. He read the letter slow, his lips moving a little, the way of a man who'd taught himself letters late. Well, Beckett said when he was done. He set it down. It says you owe the bank on a note against your land. Says the note's come due. Says if you can't pay the whole of it by spring thaw, the bank takes the ranch. He looked up. You owe the bank, Eli. I owe them nothing. I paid that land off 4 years ago. I've got the paper at home that says so. Then there's no note. There's a note now. Eli nodded at the letter. Renton owns the bank. Renton makes the paper. A man who makes the paper can make it say what he likes. Beckett rubbed his jaw. He was quiet a while. That's a serious thing to say about a serious man. You think I'm wrong? Beckett didn't answer that, which was its own answer. He'd been the law in Coldwater Bend long enough to know exactly how serious Silas Renton was, and exactly which way the wind blew when a man with a bank decided he wanted a thing. Here's the truth of it, Beckett said finally. And I'll give it to you straight, because you'd know if I didn't. The law leans. It's supposed to stand up straight and weigh things even. But it's held up by men, and men lean toward money. A judge owes the bank. A clerk wants to keep his place. So when a rich man pushes, the law tends to lean the way he's pushing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But here's the other half, and don't you forget it. The law leans. It doesn't have to fall. The whole reason there's a man in this chair with a badge is so somebody's leaning the other way. The law's made by men, Eli, and men get it wrong every day. In big ways and small, my job, the only job worth a damn, is dragging the thing back toward fair when it leans too far. Sometimes I win that. Sometimes I don't. But I never stop pulling. Eli took that in. It was about the most a man could honestly promise. And Beckett was an honest man. And he'd said it plain. There's the other matter, Beckett said. Careful now. The girl's Eli's eyes came up. Word is, Renton's been talking. Quiet, around the right ears. Saying 2 children showed up with no people and no papers. Saying strays like that belong to the county. Saying maybe Eli Crow's not a fit man to keep them. What with his history? Beckett held up a hand before Eli could rise. I'm not saying it's true. I'm telling you what he's saying. A man like Renton, he doesn't fight you in the open, if he can help it. He fights you sideways. He found the thing you'd bleed for, and he's pressing on it to see what you'll give up, to make him stop. Eli's hands had closed into fists on his knees. He made them open. What do I do? You make them yours. Legal. On paper of your own. Beckett said it simple. Right now, those girls are nobodies in the eyes of the law, and nobodies is a thing the county can claim. But a child with a father, a child with papers, a name, a man legally bound to her, that's a whole different fight. You adopt them, Eli. You go before the judge, and you make it law that they're your daughters. Then, when Renton says they're strays, you hand him a paper that says they're crows. Paper beats paper. It's the only language his kind respects. And if the judge owes Renton, then we make it so the judge can't say no in front of God and the whole town without showing what he is. Beckett almost smiled. Sunlight, Eli. Renton does his work in the dark, so we do ours where everybody can see. Harder to do a crooked thing when the whole town's watching you do it. Eli rode home with 2 stones in his chest now instead of 1. But the second one had a shape to it, a thing to do, a fight he could fight. Ada was at the ranch when he got back. She'd come on her Thursday and stayed to put liniment on Wren's chapped hands. And she read his face the second he came through the door the same way Wren did, he told her. All of it. The note, the talk about the county, what Beckett had said. She was quiet a moment. Then she said a thing that cost her. He could tell, by the way she looked at the floor to say it. There's something you should know, since we're trading hard news. She drew a breath. The town board met last week. They want to bring in a doctor from Cheyenne, a man. They've as good as told me my time here is done, come summer. Said the town's growing and needs a proper physician. The word came out bitter. 6 years, and 1 letter from Cheyenne, and I'm to pack my bag. Eli felt the floor tilt under that. He had not let himself think on it. The shape of his days now. Thursdays and gold afternoons, and a hand resting almost against his. He had not let himself know how much of it he'd come to count on, until she said the word summer, like it was a wall. You'll fight it, he said. With what? They've got the bank's money, and a man with a diploma, and every voice that ever said a woman's got no place. She shook him out here because nobody else would have me. A frontier town's the one place a woman doctor can get a foot in the door. If they push me out of here, there's no smaller town to fall back to. This was the edge of the map for me, Eli. There's no further west to go. She looked up at him then, and there was the whole hard fact of it in her eyes. That staying would cost her. That leaving would cost her more. That she was a person with a worth the world kept trying to price too low. And she was tired, clear down to the bone of the pricing. A person is a person, Eli said, quiet, giving her own words back to her, whether they wear a skirt or a sidearm. You told me that, first night. Her eyes went bright. She looked away fast. Don't use my own sermons on me, Crow, she said. But she didn't move toward the door, and she stayed for supper. And longer than supper, and the lamp in the ranch window burned late into the cold dark. It was Junie who gave them the thread, though she did it without a word. She was talking more now. Not much. A word here, a short string of them there. Always quiet, always to Wren or to the horse before she'd say a thing to a grown person. But the voice had come back, and once a thing comes back, it grows. Ada had said as much. Make the world safe and steady, and it returns. It was returning. One evening she was on the floor by the stove with a slate and a nub of chalk, and she was not making letters. She was drawing. Eli paid it no mind at first. Children draw. Then he looked closer at what was coming up under her small hand, and the back of his neck went cold. A room, a table, and a tall figure standing over a smaller one, a hand raised. The smallest figure on the floor. Junie, gentle, crouching down. Who's that, honey? Junie's chalk stopped. She looked at the drawing a long moment. Then she said, in that small, rusty voice, the man who came about Mama's wages. Wren had gone still across the room. What man? Eli kept his voice even. Easy. The way he talked to a spooked horse. He came to where Mama worked. The kitchen, Junie's eyes stayed on the slate. He told the lady that owned it that Mama stole. Mama didn't steal. But after that, the lady wouldn't let Mama work no more. And then we didn't have money for the doctor, and Mama got the cough worse and worse. Her chalk moved, small, going over the figure on the floor again and again. And the man came back and stood over her and said, if she talked to anybody about the other thing, the land thing, it'd go bad for her girls. And Mama couldn't get up off the floor to make him leave. The room was dead quiet, just the stove ticking. What did he look like, this man? Eli asked. Big, a big hat. He smelled like a horse and like whiskey. Junie scrunched her face, remembering. Mama called him a name when he left. She said it after the door shut. Real quiet, so he wouldn't hear, she said. That Boyd. That dog of Renton's. Renton. Eli stayed crouched there a long moment, holding very still the way a man holds still when the ground has shifted and he's waiting to learn how far. Wren came and stood beside her sister and put a hand on her head. She didn't get sick by accident, Wren said, low and hard, older than 9. He took her work. He scared her. And there wasn't money for medicine. That's how she died. She looked at Eli. Nobody put a knife in her. But he killed her just the same. Just slow. Just where you couldn't see it. Eli had hunted men in his old life. He knew the kind of killing that left a body and a smoking gun. This was the other kind. The kind a powerful man could do with a word in the right ear. A lie about stolen wages. A threat at a sickbed. The kind that left no mark on him and a fresh grave on somebody else. The cleaner kind. The colder kind. The kind the law had a hard time even calling a crime. How'd you come to be on that train? He asked soft. How'd you come here? To me. Wren went to the corner where their few things were piled. The little bundle they'd come with. All they owned in the world. She dug in it and came up with something and brought it to him and put it in his hands. A kerchief. Faded blue, worn soft as water. And in the corner, in small, careful stitches gone loose with age, a pattern of climbing vine and leaves. Eli's breath stopped. He knew that stitch. He knew it the way you know your own hand. Mary had made this. Mary, who liked things that grew. Who'd stitched vines on everything she could get a needle into. Who'd carved them, or had them carved, up a doorframe in this very house. He'd buried her 5 years ago, and here was her hand in his hands, faded but sure. Where did you get this, he said. His voice had gone rough. Mama had it, always, from before us. Wren watched his face. She said a lady gave it to her. A long time ago when they worked together, before either of them was married. The lady was kind to her when nobody else was. Mama kept it her whole life. When she was dying, she gave it to me, and she said, you find your way to Wyoming, to Coldwater Bend, and you find a man named Crow. She said the kind lady married him. She said if there was one decent man left in the world, it'd be the man that kind lady chose. Wren's voice wavered for the first time since the freight car. She said his name, like it was the last safe place on the map. Eli sat down on the floor. He had to. His legs would not hold the weight of it, Mary. Mary had known these girls' mother, years and miles ago. 2 young women working a kitchen, and Mary had been kind to a friendless girl, the way Mary was kind to everyone. And that girl had carried Mary's kerchief and Mary's name across a whole hard life, and at the end of it, dying, with nowhere left to send her children. She had remembered the one good man her one kind friend had married, and she had aimed her daughters at him, like the last arrow she had. It was not chance, it was not luck, it was Mary, reaching across 5 years and the grave, sending him 2 children to keep. She sent you to me, he said. He looked at the 2 of them, the hard 9-year-old and the small one, with her voice come back, and his eyes were wet, and he did not care who saw. Your mama, and before her, my Mary, 2 women who never gave up on the idea that there was kindness still out there to be found. They were right. There was. It's right here. It's me, I'm here. He folded the kerchief and held it to his chest. You're not strays. You never were. You were aimed. Somebody who loved you pointed you at the one door that would open. And it opened. You hear me. You came home. Wren did not nod. She did the thing she had never done. She stepped in against him, stiff at first and then not stiff, and put her face against his shoulder, and let go of a thing she'd been holding since long before the snow. Junie crawled into his lap with the slate still in her hand, the terrible drawing face down now against the floor. And she said, clear as anything, the first whole sentence Eli had heard from her. You can stay, Eli said. I'm going to make it so no man on earth can say otherwise. Papers and a judge and a name. You're going to be Crows. Legal. Forever. He held them both. I should have been your father from the first morning. Now I'm going to make the law agree with me. Outside, the wind worked at the corners of the house Mary built, but the stove was warm, and there were three of them holding on in its light. And somewhere, out in the dark, a powerful man was about to learn that the children he'd tried to throw away had found the one door that would not close. It came the way Eli figured it would, sideways, in the dark. He'd filed the adoption papers with the county clerk on a Monday. By Wednesday, the whole town knew, because Beckett had made sure the whole town knew. Sunlight, he'd said, so they'd done it loud. A notice posted on the board outside the courthouse. A date set before the judge. Eli Crow means to make those two girls his daughters in the eyes of the law, and let any man who objects say so to his face. Renton did not say so to his face. Renton sent Boyd. It was the gray hour before dawn when Eli woke to the horses screaming in the corral. Not the nervous bunching of a wolf night. Worse. He was up and at the window with the rifle in his hands before he was fully awake. And the spare room door stood open. And the spare room was empty. The girls were gone. There was a paper on the kitchen table, weighted with a stone. Eli's hands shook reading it, and his hands did not shake. The words were plain. Bring the deed to your land. Signed over to Devil's Notch by noon. Come alone. Come unarmed. The girls come home when the land changes hands. Don't, and they don't. It was not signed. It did not need to be. Eli stood very still in the cold kitchen with the note in his fist. And for one black moment, the old thing rose up in him. The thing he'd buried with Mary. The thing that had once made men call him the quiet man, because the quiet was the last thing they heard. 5 years he'd kept it down. It came up now like floodwater. Then he made himself breathe. He made himself think. Because thinking was the thing that kept children alive. And the old black thing only got them killed. He rode for town. Not to obey the note, to break it. Beckett listened with his jaw going harder by the word. Devil's Notch, he said. I know it. One way in, one way out. A drop on the north side a man wouldn't walk away from. He picked it, so he'd see you coming. He was already pulling on his coat, checking his guns. He's also picked it so he can come up the back, through the brakes, on foot, while he's watching the road. A man so busy laying a trap, don't always look behind him, he said alone. He says a lot of things. Beckett looked at him. You go up the road, slow, with a folded paper in your hand that he'll think is the deed. You keep his eyes on you. I come up the back with 2 men I trust. We don't move till the girls are clear of him. You understand me, Eli? Not till they're clear. You let him talk. You let him gloat. Gloating buys us time to get into place. Can you hold your temper long enough to let a man like that run his mouth? Eli thought about the old black thing. For them, he said, I can hold anything. Devil's Notch was a gash in the rock where the wind came through like it had somewhere to be. Eli rode up the road into it at a walk, in the open, a folded square of paper in his gloved hand. The cold bit through everything. Boyd was there, big, just like Junie had said. A big hat, a big coat, 2 men with rifles flanking him, and behind them, against the rock, the 2 girls. Wren stood straight with her chin up and her arm around her sister. Junie was white as the snow, but she was on her feet, alive. Both of them. Something in Eli's chest unlocked, seeing them alive, and something else locked down hard and cold. Far enough, Boyd called. You bring it. I brought it. Eli held the paper up, but did not come closer. Let them walk to me first. Then you get the paper. Boyd laughed. That ain't how this goes. It's how it goes. Eli kept his voice flat and easy. The voice you use on a green horse. You think I signed my land over without reading every line. You think Renton wants a deed a court can throw out. Let the girls come to me. I hand you the paper. Everybody goes home. That's the deal a smart man takes. He was buying time. He could feel it. Somewhere up in the brakes behind Boyd, the slow, careful movement of men in the rocks. He had to keep Boyd's eyes forward, so he kept talking. He let Boyd argue. He let Boyd a little about how Renton always got what Renton wanted. How a man with a bank never lost. How the smart thing was to learn that early. Eli nodded along like he was beaten. Like a man choosing the least bad door. It bought I said. Calm, not loud. Take your sister. Walk to me slow. Don't run. The girls moved. Boyd's hand twitched toward his gun. I didn't say now, Eli said. 2 things happened at once. The girls broke into a run, and Beckett's voice cracked down out of the rocks above. Marshal hands where I can see them. Every one of you. It came apart fast after that. One of Boyd's men spun toward the voice, and a rifle spoke from the brakes, and the man went down clutching his shoulder, his gun skidding away in the snow. The other dropped his rifle and put his hands in the air, so fast he near fell over. Boyd lunged for Wren. Eli was already off his horse. He hit Boyd low, and they both went down hard in the snow, and they rolled, and Boyd was big and strong and fighting for his neck now. A fist caught Eli over the eye. Another in the ribs. Boyd got a hand around Eli's throat and squeezed and dragged them both toward the lip of the drop. The north side, the long fall. Same fall I gave plenty, Boyd snarled. Same one's coming for you. Eli got a boot braced. He got a hand free. He drove it up under Boyd's jaw, and the big man's grip broke. And Eli rolled them away from the edge, hard, and came up on top with his pistol out of his coat, and the barrel pressed to Boyd's forehead. And he stopped. The wind screamed through the notch. Boyd lay still under the gun, breathing hard, his eyes gone wide. Eli's finger was on the trigger. The old black thing was right there. Easy, a half-pound of pressure, and it would be done. The man who'd stood over a dying woman. The man who'd put 2 children in a freight car. And the 2 children were watching. Wren stood in the snow with Junie behind her. Both of them frozen. Both of them looking at him over the barrel of his gun. Looking to see what he was. Looking to learn. The way children learn everything. By watching the grown person, they decided to trust. Eli held there one long breath. Then he let the pressure off the trigger. He took the gun away from Boyd's head. He stood up slow, and he holstered it. And he stepped back. No, he said, not to Boyd, to the girls, to himself. I'm not going to do it. Not because he doesn't deserve it, because you're watching. And I will not teach you that hate is what wins. A man can be hard, a man can be ready, but the day you let the hate use your hand, you've let the worst man you ever met decide who you are. He looked down at Boyd. You don't get to make me into you. None of you do. Beckett came down out of the rocks then with his men, and the cuffs came out, and Boyd lay there in the snow, with all the fight run out of him. He'll talk, Beckett said, hauling him up. His kind always talks, once they see which way it's going. Won't take much to learn who sent him. He was right. He didn't. Wren ran into Eli then, and Junie after her, and he went down on his knees in the bloody snow and gathered them both against him and held on, while the wind howled and the dawn came up gray and cold and clean over Devil's Notch. You came, Wren said into his coat. I'll always come, Eli said. Always. Off to the side, unnoticed in the worst of it. Ada had ridden up behind the marshal's men, her bag already open. She came to Eli now and pressed a cloth to the gash over his eye, her hand steady, her face not steady at all. Hold still, you stubborn fool, she said. Her voice cracked clean down the middle of it. Hold still and let me look at you. He held still. He looked at her, looking at him. And neither of them said the thing. Not yet. But it was there in the cold morning air between them, plain as the blood and the snow, and they both knew it. And that was enough for now. The courtroom in Coldwater Bend was just the back of the land office, with chairs in rows. But on the day of the hearing, it was full to the walls. Word had gone out, the way Beckett liked it. Eli Crow's adoption was up before the judge, and Silas Renton meant to fight it. And a man would have to be dead not to come watch a thing like that. They packed in shoulder to shoulder, ranchers and shopkeepers and the curious. Odessa near the front, with her arms folded. Ada beside the girls in the second row. Renton came in his good coat with a lawyer from Cheyenne. Boyd was in the county jail and would not look anybody in the eye anymore. But Renton walked in smiling like he'd already won, because men like Renton believe right up until the end that money is a kind of weather, and the law a kind of crop, and both of them his to harvest. His lawyer stood and made it sound reasonable. A man of violent history. A widower alone on a failing ranch the bank was about to foreclose. 2 children of unknown people. No kin, no papers. Surely the county, with its institutions, was the fit and proper place for such unfortunate strays. And then the lawyer did the thing Eli had known was coming, the thing that turned Eli's stomach. He held up the note from the freight car. Unwanted. Somehow Renton had got hold of it. or had a copy made, the two charcoal words large for the room to see. Their own people wrote this, the lawyer said, walking it slow down the front row. Their own blood pinned this to them and put them out. If the people who made these children would not have them, by what right does this man claim them now? It landed in the room. Eli could feel it land. A few heads turned. A few folks who'd been on his side looked for a moment. Then Beckett testified, plain and hard, about a note left at Eli's house, and two children stolen in the night, and a man named Boyd taken at Devil's Notch with a confession already half out of his mouth. He laid out the false banknote and the lie about stolen wages and the threats at a dying woman's bed. The room got very quiet. Odessa stood and told them, in her steady voice, what she'd seen of the two girls these weeks. How they'd come in like starved things and grown warm and fed at her counter. How the older one had begun to laugh again, and the little one had found her voice. I know what it is, she said, looking right at the rows of faces. To have a man hold up a paper and say it makes you less than a person. I lived a whole life under that kind of paper. And I am telling you, a paper can lie, a word can lie. Those two girls are no more unwanted than the sun is unwanted. Somebody just lied on them. In charcoal, the way somebody once lied on me. In ink, Ada. Cool and clear. A doctor giving facts. The girl's health when she found them. The pneumonia, the slow mending. The mute child who spoke again only once she was safe. You want to know if they're wanted, she said. Look at what wanting did. I have watched that man take two children the world threw away and make them whole. That is not a thing the county does in an institution. That is a thing a father does. I have seen it with my own eyes, and I am not in the habit of lying for anyone. And then Eli stood. He was not a man of speeches. He stood with his hat in his hands, and the gash over his eye still healing. And he looked at the judge, and then he looked at the note in the lawyer's hand, those two ugly words, and he found he was not afraid of them anymore. Somebody wrote that to throw these girls away, he said. I've thought a lot about who and why, and I've stopped caring. Because here's the thing I've learned, and it took me near my whole life to learn it. A person doesn't become a throwaway just because somebody says so. You can write unwanted on a child. You can pin it to her in the cold, but the word doesn't make it true. It only tells you something about the hand that wrote it. He turned and faced the room. All of them. A child's worth isn't measured in anybody's purse. It isn't a thing the world hands out to give or to take back. You're born with it. Every one of you was. Every child in this territory is. All the rest of us get to decide is whether we treat them like it's true, or whether we treat them like that note. And which one we choose says everything about us, and not one single thing about them. The room was dead silent. And into that silence, a small voice. He didn't write it. Heads turned. Junie had stood up in the second row, 5 years old, white-faced, her small hands fisted at her sides, but on her own 2 feet and speaking, in front of all those grown people. The child who 3 weeks ago had not been able to make a sound. Renton's man did it, Junie said, and her voice did not waver. Boyd, I saw him. He came about Mama's wages, and he stood over her, and after she died he wrote on the paper and pinned it on me himself. My mama never threw us away. My mama sent us to find a good man. And we found him, she pointed, her small arm straight at Silas Renton in his good coat. That man's people did it. And then he held it up, like my mama done it. But she didn't. He did. You could have heard the snow fall outside. Renton's smile was gone. He'd built his whole life on the quiet, on doing his work where nobody could see. And now a 5-year-old he'd tried to erase was standing in a packed room, pointing at him in the bright, clear light. And there was nowhere left to do his work in the dark. The judge, who may have owed the bank, looked around at a courtroom full of his neighbors, all looking back, and found that sunlight is a hard thing to rule against. It did not all finish that morning. There would be more for the courts, charges against Boyd and against Renton both. The slow grind of the law that Beckett had promised to keep dragging back toward fair. But the judge ruled on the thing in front of him. The note was a lie. The girls had a man who'd bled for them and a town that had stood up for them. And that was a sight more than the county could offer. He granted the adoption. Spring came late that year, But it came, the way it always does. The snow going off the south slopes first, and the creek waking up loud in the night. They held the hearing to make it final on a morning so bright it hurt. The judge asked the questions the law required, dry and proper. And then he looked over his spectacles at the older girl and asked the one that mattered. "Young lady, do you wish to take the name Crow and be this man's daughter in the eyes of the law and of this territory?" Wren stood up, the girl who'd come off that train trusting nothing and no one, who'd kept a kitchen knife by the door against a man who might not come back. She looked at Eli. Then she looked at the judge. "I do," she said. "Both of us do. I'm answering for my sister because I'm the oldest. And that's my job. But she'll tell you herself if you ask her." "I'll ask her," the judge said, not unkindly. "Junie Crow, is that a name you'd like to keep?" And Junie, on her feet, clear as a bell in that quiet room, said, "Yes, sir. It's the best name I ever had." It was done with a stamp and a signature, the way the biggest things sometimes are. Wren Crow, Junie Crow, daughters, by law, forever. They married in the ranch yard when the grass came in green. Eli and Ada, with the mountains still white at the top and the whole valley going gold and new below. It was a small thing and a plain thing. No church, no fuss. Beckett stood up for Eli. Odessa cooked for 2 days and fed the whole gathering off the back of a wagon, and would not let a soul lift a finger to help her. Said it was her gift, and a gift you don't take back. The town came. Most of it. The same town that had whispered about the woman doctor and the quiet man and his 2 strays. They came now in their good clothes, and they stood in the yard, and they were glad. The way people are glad when a thing turns out, right after they were afraid it wouldn't. Not all of them. Eli noted that, standing up there with Ada's hand in his. A few stayed home. A few stood at the edge with their arms folded and their faces closed. The ones who'd never quite swallowed a woman with a scalpel, or a freedwoman's cooking, or a man who'd kneel in the snow for children that weren't his blood. They were still out there. Those few, they'd be out there a long time. And Eli found he was glad of it in a strange way, because it meant this was real. A town that turned all the way kind overnight would have been a fairy tale. And fairy tales don't hold. A few cold faces at the edge of the yard meant the warm ones had chosen it, against something on purpose. That was worth more. A thing you have to choose against the grain is always worth more than a thing that comes easy. That evening, when the last wagon had rattled off down the road and the girls were chasing each other through the new grass with Biscuit watching over the rail, Eli went into the house and took down the note. He'd kept it, folded small, in a drawer all winter. He wasn't sure why, except that a man ought to look his enemies in the face before he's done with them. He carried it to the hearth where the evening fire was going. The 2 charcoal words faded now, but still there. Unwanted. He fed it to the flame and watched it curl and go. Wren had come in behind him, quiet on her bare feet. She watched it burn. She said, "Good," Eli agreed. She had a fresh slat of pine in her hand, smooth, and the carving knife, the kitchen one, the one she'd once held against the dark. She'd been at it for days out on the porch, working slow. And she set it now on the mantel where the note had been kept all winter. 3 words, cut deep and a little crooked. The way a first thing is always a little crooked. Wanted, loved, home. Eli looked at it a long while. Then he put his hand on the back of her head, just for a moment, the way you do. "That's the straightest crooked carving I ever saw," he said. Later they sat out on the porch, the 4 of them, while the light went down behind the mountains and turned the whole sky the colors it saves for the end of a good day. Junie was asleep against Ada's side. Wren sat on the top step, leaning back against Eli's knee. The rocking chair, empty so long it had become a part of the porch like a fence post, held a person again, and the person was Ada, rocking slow, and it did not feel like a betrayal of anything. It felt like the house finally getting to be what it was built for. "They tried to put a price on you," Eli said to the girls, to the evening, to himself. "Wrote a word on you and shipped you off like freight. Folks do that. They look at a person and they try to decide what that person's worth. And most times they decide too low. And a few times they decide a person's worth nothing at all." He shook his head slow, but they were wrong. They're always wrong when they do that. Worth isn't a thing somebody hands you and somebody else can take. You came into this world already carrying everything you'd ever need to be worth keeping. Then how'd we end up on the train? Wren asked, not bitter, just wanting to understand the shape of it. Because being worth something and being treated like it aren't always the same, Eli said. That's the hard part. That's the part the world keeps getting wrong. And the only fix for it, the only one there is people deciding, one at a time, to treat each other like the thing they already are. He looked down at her. Love isn't something you find lying around. Wren, I used to think it was. I was wrong about that too. It's something you build, plank by plank, day by day, choosing it again, every morning even when it's cold and you're tired. We're going to build it for a long time, you and me and your sister and Ada. The rest of our lives, I expect. Wren leaned her head back against his knee and looked up at the sky going dark and the first stars coming out over the mountains Mary had loved. All right, she said, simple as that. Let's build it. And they sat there together while the dark came on soft and the creek ran loud in the new spring night. Four people who had each been thrown away by something and had found their way, against the odds and against the cold, to the one porch that would have them. Home, when the wind finally settled over Coldwater Bend and the last echoes of fear, and silence faded into the wide Wyoming sky. What remained was not just a story of survival, but a story of belonging. Out here in the West, people often believe that land is what defines a man, that possession is what gives life meaning, and that strength is measured in what you can take and hold. But this story proved something far greater, something the frontier rarely speaks aloud. It is not what a man owns that defines him, it is what he chooses to protect when he has nothing to gain and everything to lose. Eli Crow was never a man searching for heroes. He was a man who had already buried his past, buried his love, and buried the part of himself that once believed in tomorrow. The ranch was not a dream anymore. It was simply survival. Quiet days, quiet work, and a quiet heart that had long stopped expecting anything to return. But the West has a way of testing the silence a man builds around himself. And on a frozen morning, when a freight car door opened onto two children, marked with the word Unwanted, that silence broke. What followed was not just rescue. It was transformation. Because sometimes life does not ask you who you are when things are easy. It asks you who you are when a child looks into your eyes and has nothing left but trust or fear. Wren and Junie did not arrive in Eli's life as burdens. They arrived as questions. Questions the world had refused to answer. And in choosing them, in refusing to let them be discarded like broken things, Eli did something far more powerful than saving lives. He rebuilt meaning itself. But this story is not only about him. It is also about Ada Vance, a woman who stood in rooms where she was not wanted, who healed children while the world debated her right to exist as a doctor. She did not fight with guns or law books, but with patience, skill, and the unshakable truth that a life is a life, no matter who is willing to recognize it. And it is about Wren, who learned too early that trust is dangerous, and Junie, who lost her voice in a world too cruel to hear it. Yet even in silence, even in fear, they carried something the world tried to erase, but never truly could worth. That is the deepest truth this story leaves behind. No word written on paper, no matter how cruel, no matter how official, has the power to define a human soul. Not unwanted, not stray, not nothing. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.